Hi, students. So the first thing I want to tell you about this week is that in this reading, as with other readings I've done in the past with Tocqueville, Frederick Douglass, with even people as recent as MLK and Malcolm X, there's a difference in language that is used both for self-identification and identification of other groups. So I just wanted to make you aware of that as you're going into the text. And the text is considered Du Bois' magnum opus, but it can be pretty brutal at times. What he's trying to do is record a history of Reconstruction. Now, what he is arguing against is this argument that was present during his lifetime that Reconstruction failed and that it failed because of the faults of Black Americans. And his suggestion is that this is the entirely incorrect narrative. That if you look at what happened in Reconstruction, you'll find that there are very clear socioeconomic pressures and changes and political pressures and changes that made Reconstruction sort of doomed to fail. And that its failure becomes what you might call setting the stage for the Jim Crow era and the other eras of racial discrimination to follow. So it's a really important text in the sense that it's one of the earliest ones we have that is cataloging the ways that this went wrong. And Reconstruction, of course, is what happened after the Civil War. You're trying to have what Lincoln called the new birth of freedom in the land. But between two parts of the country, one part which wanted to enslave people and doesn't think that they should have lost the war. And so they don't want to agree to the different things that come out of Reconstruction politically. They see it as an incursion on their way of life and basically like a invention of foreign people they don't recognize as being legitimate leaders. This is, of course, referring not to the Black Americans in the South who were put in a difficult period, difficult place during Reconstruction because they were sort of, I guess you might say, going to be affected by decisions that both the North and the South made, and decisions that they actually didn't have much of an ability to push back on. In fact, one of the things that becomes really interesting from a historical perspective is it is the ability to push back through becoming self-sufficient through businesses, is one way Du Bois puts it, or to not give in to exploitative labor contracts, or to even vote. Those were ways of pushing back, right? So the idea is that, according to him, those ways are targeted and stopped. And so I'm just going to go through the PowerPoint with you a little bit because I think it's better for me to walk you through the high points than to sort of spell it all out for you. Du Bois is an American sociologist. He was actually the first Black American to earn a Harvard doctorate. you see him probably, if you've read him before, in conjunction with writings by Booker T. Washington, where they're debating how to approach the problem of post-Reconstruction racism in America. He was born in 1868 and he lived to 1693. Now, so far in the course, we've seen that a big part of the problem of the new birth of freedom is the problem of labor. And what do I mean by the problem of labor? Well, like, let's give an example. When we were talking about the progressives, and Wilson talks about the way that he has seen transitions in economic life that have taken place over time, and that our transitions of the economy haven't changed our social expectations about work. Or you can go back earlier to Tocqueville and the industrial aristocracy reading we did. Basically, you have this problem where you're trying to I guess if you took ancient and medieval political thought with me or with someone else, or if you've studied it on your own, all the republics in the ancient world had people they disenfranchised and used as labor. And they didn't get the full benefits of citizenship, but they held up the economy of the republics. That's ending in the United States, legally ending at this point. But you still have the problem that there's this hard, difficult labor that people don't necessarily want to be exploited into doing, and that the terms of that labor are unjust. Particularly for Du Bois, the problem he's looking at is that he's transitioning from a system where it's based on forced labor of Black Americans with poor working conditions in the institution of slavery. Poor working conditions is an understatement. To one that regards them as free citizens, but there's then this economic vacuum, Du Bois says, of labor that had been there and had been coerced and now isn't there. This is an important part of the story of the labor movement and progressive movement that we've been talking about, but those issues are racialized in Reconstruction. He has two theses. The first is that Reconstruction is a failure, and that he calls it a beginning of another civil war. In fact, that the Civil War never ceased. And he also suggests that, again, like I mentioned, the people who are blamed for its failure are not the people who should be blamed. The aim of Reconstruction, in his mind, and I think when you read the text, it's a compelling argument, was to build a new economic system on the labor of freed men and women, okay, who had once been enslaved, through policy and cultural power, despite the fact that we have these post-war amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, that are supposed to protect them, and the laws that come out of Congress that are based on those amendments. So after Reconstruction is beginning, the resistance to it, he says, goes through different phases. One is post-war lawlessness, which he says is normal to most wars, right? The second is what he calls a labor war. The third is, and by labor war, what he means is it's this overlapping factor where people are trying to secure capital in what they can, and what they can secure capital in is land. But then they need and land and maybe factories and things like this. But then they need labor. And so they want to make the terms of that labor as beneficial to them as possible as the economy is recovering from the war. The third thing that happens is that white and Black men end up fighting for these same low-wage jobs that are set on, whose terms are set by people who are trying to be as exploitative as possible. So this would be, of course, in this era where we're gearing up, headed into living in the robber barons, right? Which you would have, I mean, that's come out of some of our study of the progressives. The end of this is the rise of a white middle class, he says, reinforced by social organizations and mores. Now, how do we end up there? It's a little more complex than that. What happens is that there's like a truce, in his opinion, between the people who we're trying to exploit labor and white laborers, and they're able to negotiate a way of life that is able to satisfy or stabilize them both, but it's predicated on leaving out the Black American from access to those same kinds of economic opportunities that bring stability, that bring the middle class around. He says that after the war, you have Black Americans who have basically, in the South, they're free, but it's not like they possess anything to start their new freedom, because they were forbidden to have that. And in some cases, they were forbidden to be literate. Tocqueville talks about that at one point. And then you also have, in the same space, he says, people who lost the war, that are mad that they lost the war, that went through things that were bad in the war, in the sense that they experienced the traumas of war, and they blame the people who, not the people who fought the war with, but they blame the people who have been freed. So if there's a transference of anger in the South, he thinks, to the Union, from the Union to Black Americans who lived in the South. And he even describes these vigilante bands that move around as soldiers. So that becomes, this transference of anger becomes a really important part of the story of Reconstruction. There are several stories that you'll read in his account that are pretty heartbreaking. And he's getting them from the histories of the time period, and also from the records into the KKK investigation that Congress held at one point, documenting exploitation, rape, abuse, beatings, and lynchings and other forms of murder. So there was violence before Reconstruction, he says, of course. That's part of why the war happened. But the violence after Reconstruction is particularly a response to the fact that people who were once considered by the Constitution to be property are now totally enfranchised. And there's resentment of that, even though that is the right thing to do. It was the right thing to happen. What Du Bois thinks would have made this easier, and he's coming at this from a pragmatic perspective, not from the perspective of, not a moral perspective. What he thinks would have made things easier is if the plantation land would have been equally given to those who worked with it as slaves in the past, as enslaved persons in the past, with some sort of compensation of the former owner for their financial loss. And this is part of where the story gets a little more complicated, because up till now, he's painting this pretty bleak picture of the response to the South, to Reconstruction, and certainly it was bleak. But he blames at this point what he calls the economic selfishness of the North. Okay. They didn't want to help African Americans as much as they could after the war financially. And they didn't want to have to compensate former plantation owners. Okay. This combined with the persistent racism of the planter class, who think that there shouldn't even be freedom for non-white Americans, is what he calls the result of federal reconstruction. So one of the ways that he catalogs this event is different times that economic terrorism is used to harm Black Americans and to take away sort of the better sources of livelihood that they were starting off with, whether it would be independent farming or store owning. He talks about people being killed over this or whipped over this. Even in the labor itself, if you were in a bad contract, you could still be whipped and things like this. I mean, technically by law, you can't, but Du Bois is able to catalog what this is happening. So what lets this happen? Because obviously the laws aren't supposed to let that happen. And this is an interesting political point. And I think if you were studying this from a comparative politics perspective, you'd find something similar in post-war societies. You have organizations like the KKK and the Night of the White Camellia who are able to make each individual feel unashamed of these kind of acts of terrorism, and that it lets them be done, these acts be done anonymously, and with the promise that they won't be able to rat on each other, because if one says something, then they implicate themselves. So here, nowadays you hear a lot of talk about racism being connected to economic anxiety. Du Bois has an early version of this argument, and he doesn't say that it explains all of it. But what he thinks is driving these secret organizations, in part, is the fear of losing their jobs, the fear of feeling declassed, degraded, or disgraced, the fear of losing their hopes, losing their savings, losing their plans for the children. And he says also the fear of pangs of hunger, of dirt and crime. The last three that he mentions, he says, that's real, because it's a post-war society and a lot of people went through that in the war. The first ones are kind of more about loss of status, and they're more about perception than reality. And what compounds all of this, he says, is this shared fear between all Americans in modern industrial society, which is a fear of unemployment, and not being able to be employable, right? And this exacerbates the problems that are already present in the South. So in the end, he thinks there's just this sort of like grand trick, basically, where you have between these secret organizations, between the sort of flouting of the law, and in a lot of cases, the reluctance of the North to actually enforce the law in Reconstruction, and the different economic conditions I discussed, he says, look, what happens is there's this sort of trick. By putting the focus on race, those who were better off post-war, and you see the gradual accruing of capital in dramatically unequal ways after the war. I'm not saying accruing capital is bad, but there was dramatic inequality in it. So those who were better off were able to unfairly treat white workers by distracting them by scapegoating Black workers. So as long as they felt like they weren't getting the worst bit, they felt like they were in on a good deal. And this makes what Du Bois thinks of as a third way impossible. That third way is some sort of unity between Black and white working class citizens, who are going to together demand more equitable treatment in the workplace. This, he thinks, is especially surprising, and it shows the persistence of racism, given that a lot of this could have been mitigated in the South if in the South they just would have made good counter offers to offers that were being made when the federal government was involved in trying to distribute wages and goods. So when all of this is happening, the North fails to consecrate the lawmakers of the South. And this is because, this is the added twist, in the North, there is racism. And in the North, there's also classism. So they don't want an empowered labor class, Black or white. And they don't want to have Black Americans live where they live. Because if you read Tocqueville reading at the beginning of the semester, in the North, there were civil rights a lot of times, maybe not to the full extent, but very little interaction. And so there's now this double-edged sword where racism is causing problems from both factions. There's no faction that is not racist at this point. And there are a lot of authors who say this. Du Bois isn't the only one. And there's a lot of historical evidence in this time. For example, Frederick Douglass talks about how in the Civil War, the rations and wages of Black soldiers were much less than white soldiers, and that Frederick Douglass talks about how there would be less of an attempt to get them back if they were prisoners of war. So on top of these different factors, we talked about the economic, we've talked about the secret societies, we've talked about the sort of failure of the rule of law. Then you have the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has these two cases, US v. Reese and US v. Cruikshank, that really kind of dismantle a lot of the power of the 14th and 15th Amendments. We talked about how the Slaughterhouse cases dismantled the Privileges and Immunities Clause. This is a similar thing. And what's interesting about it is that it's not just driven by race, these decisions. They're also driven by this sort of background noise of trying to consolidate industry's power, like, for example, the railroads and things like this. Suffrage is also touched. Du Bois says that Black Americans valiantly fought to keep the right to vote, but there were very systemic political, social, religious, and economic powers that were able to make that difficult. And when you study Jim Crow, you see the different statutes and stuff that this leads to. I included a link to what was called the White Parties, which was a way of excluding non-whites from being able to influence candidates in primaries. I included a link to a description of that. There's also the role of convict labor. So no one is supposed to be able to be forced into labor in these post-war amendments, right? But what ends up happening is you find there's a way around it that is found by basically inventing charges against people who are Black, and then using them to basically do the legal version at the time of slave labor as convicts. And I included a link to a discussion of that as well, a history of that as well. Some things did try to improve the situation. One thing he points out is that even though there's racism in the North, there was a lot of interest among a lot of the wealthy of the North in educating Black American men. And these men would then influence their communities. There was also a movement to train in industry and crafts, but the race and class war kind of cut that off at the pass that we talked about earlier. And then the possibility of a third party, that would be able to break away from this sort of harmful, racist, milieu of the time, it's not successful. They see that third parties won't work when Roosevelt runs again. And so in terms of political accountability coming out of third parties, it doesn't happen. So what he says happens is basically all of the things that the 14th and 15th and 13th Amendments should have granted and did grant were all either eliminated or significantly watered down. And there's no representation at the state or local level of Black Americans by Black Americans. There's no real access to the ballot because of intimidation and poll taxes and tests to vote. There's segregation then into schools and neighborhoods where goods and resources are going to be scarce. And you have basically what he calls a caste system develop, where there's this public sort of enforcing of the idea that there are some people who will have higher roles in society, and there are some people who are going to always have lower roles in society because that is their caste. This becomes what he calls normal life in the post-war South for a while. Basically, it's going to be this weird phase and this undemocratic phase, right? It means there's no democracy in the post-war South if you're disenfranchising huge amounts of people who are citizens there. And it's not really until the civil rights movement that you see the ability to begin to try to dismantle that. You also see, ironically, the use of the 14th Amendment to get political representation in the South, because they have more people counting as citizens, but they're still not letting non-white people vote. And this also means that whatever kinds of things that are happening on the federal level, the South will have, according to Du Bois, more influence than the North. All of this, he says, he's describing social institutions, he's describing systemic problems, he's describing economic problems, he's describing psychosocial problems. All of this is built, he says, on a fiction, the worst fiction ever, that there is this ineradicable difference between men that condemns some of them to always be degraded, he says. And he says this is a cheap inheritance of the world's infancy, this type of belief in inequality. And it's unworthy of people who are grown. One thing he says that's really important, and it goes back to, I think, what he pointed to as a possible solution. He says, my rise does not involve your fall, okay? No superior has interest in inferiority. If we realize humanity is one and its vast variety is its glory and not its condemnation, we can think about the allocation of good and resources along these non-tribal lines. And that just because, this goes back to one of the original problems he pointed out, just because some people are enfranchised who were not before does not mean that people who are enfranchised previously will lose their enfranchisement. What they're going to lose is their entitlement. They're going to lose what they aren't owed by the Constitution and be put in more of a real situation vis-a-vis the Constitution. But they're not being disenfranchised. Okay, and this idea of scarcity sort of underlies all of these tensions. So I hope that walks you through this text in a way that makes sense. I apologize for any background noise that there is. It's hard recording at home. Anyways, take care.